Within a month of Palworld's 1.0 release, Sekhmet quickly became a fan favorite. Not only did people leave behind thousands of Reddit comments on related posts, but Sekhmet also took over a large part of the internet, when people suddenly began posting many different fan edits that each racked up hundreds of thousands of likes. And through comments like "the devs knew what they were doing," it seems like the general consensus is that this happened because Sekhmet is designed to be fan service. Even dedicated mods back this up. In 2025, Palworld ran a favorite Pal vote, and the top 3, Chillet, Jetdragon and Anubis, lined up almost exactly with the unique visitor counts on each of their most popular mods. And Sekhmet shows a similar pattern, or rather a much more suggestive one that likely explains how the top mod seemingly gained 5 times as many visitors. But here's the problem, it's not like Sekhmet is the only Pal like this. Others do the same thing, if not arguably much better. For example, Magix's constant forward hip extension gives it an hourglass figure that's widely read as attractive. Other Pals seem to share very humanoid hairstyles. And on top of that, in at least one Pal's own lore entry, that Pal being Lavender, you're able to read that it eventually began actively pursuing humans as romantic partners. Which at least to me makes it look like the Palworld devs tried something similar before, but somehow didn't succeed. Which begs the question, what is Sekhmet doing differently? Well, that brings us to something I don't think a lot of people actually talked about. The fact that Sekhmet is much more involved in the game thanks to its work suitability. For context, based on Impulse's work suitability, they're able to help players around their base by assisting them in specific tasks. One of the most important ones, however, is handiwork, aka what this game defines as crafting. As for why that matters, that has to do with the fact that you can actually build 4 different bases within Palworld. Or more importantly, that because each base is limited to a specific number of Pals that can assist you, that the game essentially encourages you to design each of those different bases around specific dedicated production processes. The most important of which are typically going to be one dedicated crafting base and one dedicated to the production of food. And while both might seem similar at first, the difference is once a farming base is fully set up, Pals can basically stockpile crops and ingredients on their own, meaning the only reason you'll ever have to go back there is to actually make their food, which again, because of the sheer amount of ingredients you end up having, isn't something you will have to do all that often. The crafting base, however, is different. You're still making new equipment constantly to keep up with the game's progression, and the only way to do that is to return to this base every time. And this causes you to experience a well-documented psychological principle called the mere exposure effect, an effect that basically suggests that the more you're exposed to something, the more you tend to like it, regardless of whatever other qualities it has. And this is one of the main ways Sekhmet begins to stand out from several other humanoid-looking Pals. In this case, because Sekhmet's best skill caters it towards a dedicated crafting base, for those players that keep it around their base, they will naturally see it much more frequently than other Pals that are instead dedicated towards the production of food. Lylene is a great example for this. On paper, it should be just as memorable to someone like Sekhmet, since it has that same attractive humanoid design going for it. And it being one of the best growth Pals only seems to make it better. But because its skills help the food production process mainly, you likely won't see it as much. Other Pals experience something similar. For example, many farming or ranching Pals only include one species that can give you a specific item. Take Chickpea, the only one that can produce eggs. Since eggs are quite an important material to have for things like cake, because without it you can't actually improve your Pals through breeding, the game essentially requires that everyone at least keep one Chickpea around their base. But there's also a big difference to someone like Chickpea compared to someone like Sekhmet, in that Chickpea isn't catered towards a certain audience. Unless it is and I'm just imagining things, I mean there's probably someone out there that sees Chickpea like that. Okay, but as much as this helps to explain why certain other humanoid Pals never reached the same publicity as Sekhmet did, it's not like Sekhmet is the only handiwork Pal that you can use for your crafting base. Which is why I actually went through every single handiwork Pal out there and came to the realization that almost all of them are humanoid, which from the looks of it should just make Sekhmet stand out even less. But after looking further into it, I came to the strange realization that this is the exact reason that, weirdly enough, pushes players to like Sekhmet even further. But before I tell you the exact percentage of humanoid-looking handiwork Pals out there, I'd like you to try and guess that number for yourself. And while we wait, I have some very exciting news. We officially have our very own Discord server. I've put a lot of work into creating spaces dedicated specifically to our community, including one activity I like to call Ponder of the Week. week. Essentially, each week I'll be posting a thought-provoking question for us to discuss, debate, and explore together. It's your job to just talk about it to the point where we just kind of lose track of what the original question was. So if you're interested in joining the server, there's a link in the description you can find, and yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Out of the 109 handiwork pals out there, 42% or around 46 of them are humanoid. Now those numbers are mostly based on what I saw people classify them as online, as well as my own opinion, but you know what, out of the total of around 300 pals out there, everyone seems to agree that between 40 to 50 of them are in fact humanoid. But wait a minute, that's close to the exact number I counted for the humanoid pals specifically dedicated towards handiwork. And even more bizarre, the latter half of those 109 handiwork pals, once you acquire in the mid to end game portions of the game, become more and more humanoid. Meaning it's almost like the game is intentionally pushing you towards keeping humanoid looking pals around your base. And this matters because that would mean even players who aren't necessarily a fan of those specific character designs are probably still going to use those exact pals because they're the best the game has to offer. But let's look at those top handiwork pals a bit closer, because while Sekhmet being in it does explain why it's very recognizable, there's still many other pals that from our current understanding should have as large of a fan base as Sekhmet does. But here's the thing, out of the top handiwork pals, Sekhmet is the one that stands out the most because it has access to a partner skill called Desert Empress. What this skill does is that when you assign Sekhmet to your base, not only does it gain a 30% increased crafting speed, but each Anubis, another Egyptian-based pal that's also working at your base, also gets a 20% increased work speed, which is different to the 30% increased crafting speed, because that 20% affects every single one of Anubis's actions. Meaning for the crafting base in particular, one of the strongest setups to focus around involves pairing one Sekhmet with a bunch of Anubises. Not to mention that Sekhmet is also probably the easiest best performing handiwork pal to acquire, in that unlike the others, its spawn location isn't locked behind specific requirements, making catching it in the wild not that much of a challenge. To the point that for the endgame level of base efficiency it provides, many players still list Sekhmet as a mid-game pal. And okay, maybe you're now thinking that the repeated exposure is put on Anubis, which in a way it is. But again, that buff solely depends on Sekhmet. And unlike Sekhmet, Anubis doesn't have an ability of its own that helps increase its base efficiency, meaning in order to get the most bang out of your buck, the best base pal for you to enhance will likely end up being Sekhmet. Meaning it's not necessarily that the game only feeds you repeated exposure of Sekhmet by making you physically see it, it also gives you a goal to keep around for much longer, which furthermore means that you're unconsciously thinking of upgrading Sekhmet even during the moments you spend outside of your base. Now, just because Sekhmet is a really good pal to keep around your base, obviously doesn't mean most people are going to run this exact same setup. But here's the thing, games like Palworld, once revolving around optimization and reaching maximum base efficiency, tend to result in people looking up guides that help them reach exactly that. Which, well, because Sekhmet is one of those exact ways to reach that goal, means a lot of people will not only make guides specifically dedicated to Sekhmet, but a lot of people will also watch those guides. And it's through content like that that Sekhmet gained such a large popularity that ultimately pushed it to the point that other people were making fan edits of it, all of which reached an even larger number of people because Sekhmet's design actually attracted two separate audiences, the fans of Palworld and the people who are attracted to those specific character designs. But Sekhmet's design isn't the only reason why those fan edits performed so well, because unlike a lot of the other humanoid pals, Sekhmet's design actually references something rather peculiar, something that weirdly enough is probably also referred to in its lore entry. Once a fierce creature feared as a symbol of death. When Anubis claimed that mantle, wealthy elites looking for a replacement beguiled the species with wine. Before long, Sekhmet became a symbol of high nobility. This entry mainly refers to Sekhmet's Egyptian design, specifically in its design after the lion-headed Egyptian goddess Sekhmet. But interestingly, the part of Sekhmet's lore entry that refers to it being replaced by Anubis isn't actually all that much of a parallel, because the stories of the Egyptian goddess Sekhmet as well as the Egyptian god Anubis don't talk about a similar event happening. On top of that, in ancient Egyptian times, people held something known as the Feast of Drunkenness, during which participants participants worshipped Sekhmet by essentially getting drunk and dancing. However, in Palworld, the one who's actually dancing is Sekhmet. So is Sekhmet really based on the Egyptian goddess if there are so many disconnecting parallels? Well, yes and no, because as it turns out, the dance Sekhmet does in-game isn't only based on Egyptian mythology. And to find what it's actually based on, we have to go to another game. The character you're seeing now is called Anka, and they're from the game Animal Crossing. You might notice that they seem quite similar to Sekhmet, and that's also because Anka shares a lot of Sekhmet's design features. Obviously, both incorporate Egyptian themes into their design, but Anka also has a bit of its own internet history, in that it became popular after someone animated them dancing to the song Camel by Sandy Martin. And it's this exact dance that people immediately noticed is similar to the one Sekhmet does in-game, meaning the lore entry of Sekhmet is also in a way reinforcing the perceived similarity to Anka, which matters because alongside Anka's internet publicity came a lot of people that, well, found them attractive. And Anka was around for much longer than Sekhmet, which to me makes it seem likely that the Palworld devs saw this design, were inspired to use it in one of their own pals, and more importantly saw how much Anka became a major internet meme and thought, why not use that to our advantage? Which isn't even too far off, because I did some more research, and as it turns out, Sekhmet was actually used as heavy promotion material to get people hyped for the official 1.0 release. And well, this seemingly worked, because during the official 1.0 release, the Steam player count reached nearly 1 million players, which, just to establish how significant this is, that's around 50% of the close to 2 million players the game had when it was first made playable in its early access 2 years ago. Now, I can't necessarily prove that copying Anka's design was what the developers had intended, but given Anka's history, the similarities become pretty difficult to ignore. And while those Steam player numbers likely weren't only affected by Sekhmet alone, the impact it had on the game probably still contributed to it quite significantly. So no, I'm not saying that Sekhmet isn't fan service, it clearly is, but I also don't think that its design alone is what actually got it there, which is why I'd like to end this video with one final message. Your Honor, as you can clearly see, I'm not the one to blame for finding Sekhmet attractive. The game is clearly the one at fault here.